Hello, and welcome to the Love Wisdom Podcast. My name is Anthony Pensa, and today's episode is a series of 5 episodes, episode 4 of 5, and it's focusing on consciousness. Now, if you haven't already, before this video begins, please subscribe to my videos, my channels. I upload information and content on philosophy and the meaning of philosophy. I'll be uploading more information of philosophy and its importance in people's lives in future videos on epistemology and other information related to philosophy. If you have any questions during this video or after this video, please leave a comment. Now, today's subject matter we're talking about today is consciousness. What specifically? Well, today we're focusing on a series on the 4th episode, and it's on consciousness and its relationship to philosophy. Now, many people think when they think about consciousness, right, and they think about the identity and reality, because in the first previous episodes I covered, if you haven't already, please watch them, on the physics of consciousness. And then we covered an introductory version of consciousness and how consciousness relates to people, the physicality. But today we're going to focus more on the theory base on consciousness and how the theory of consciousness itself is more related than people imagine and people think. So when you think about consciousness, right, and you think about reality, what comes to your mind? Many people think about materialism, right? And that materialism is an ancient idea that many Greek philosophers and other philosophers had developed that states that all matter and all reality exists of materials. So for example, your body, your mind, all these things are materials. According to the materialist, all things exist in reality based on the materials. And those materials, right, that exist, those atoms that compose those materials, create everything that we know to exist, including consciousness. And then you also have the idea of dualism, right, which is taking materialists and non-materialists and having them butt heads, essentially. People that are fighting different forms of philosophical intakes and inquiries into understanding the nature of consciousness and what constitutes human beings. Now, one famous philosopher who I mentioned earlier, Daniel Dennett, in my previous episodes, he talks about the idea of dualism and particularly that of Cartesian dualism. But he mentions René Descartes, a famous French philosopher, who spoke about the idea of consciousness and the idea of the phrase that we know today is, I think, therefore I am. Immanuel Kant spoke about this idea. But before this idea, the Latin term of res cogitum, which means I think, therefore exist, that idea was later spoken about by Kant and later extrapolated into future philosophies. But when you look at consciousness and you study the philosophical intakes, many people look at consciousness in various ways. Where does consciousness come from? Is it a material thing, or is it something that comes from the mind? Now, many philosophers debate this today, and many people think that the notion of consciousness is very complex. But with philosophers, the questions of the ideas, the questions of, right, the means in which consciousness arises is studied throughout philosophy in different ways. You have various genres of philosophy that cover this notion, such as the philosophy of mind, and then you also have other forms of philosophy that cover it as well, such as, for example, you have deontological beliefs, right? You have Kantian notions. Immanuel Kant, who's also a famous German philosopher who spoke a lot about consciousness, as well as Martin Heidegger, Arthur Schopenhauer, and other famous philosophers who are German and other nationalities in relationship to what consciousness is. Now, consciousness itself, in relationship to philosophy, stems all the way back to when it first originated in the Western culture from the Greeks. You have the Stoics, you have the Epicureans, and then you also have other famous Greek philosophers, Pythagoras, Aristotle, right, Plato, Socrates, the pre-Socratics, and then you also had ancient Eastern religions and beliefs which associated consciousness in a different way. For the Greeks, consciousness existed as more of a circular logic. And what do I mean by that? Circular in the sense of perfection. For the Eastern religions, philosophy was considered as energy, as mystic, as something unknown. But the philosophers believed that all reality, all consciousness existed, at least in the Western perspective, from the perfect idea of reality of the circle. So that's how we have the idea in science, right, of the heliocentric model, because these models were based a lot on Aristotelian logic and Aristotelian beliefs. Aristotle, being one of the first biologists, had actually established the idea and notion of consciousness through this notion of the sphere or the circle, right? And we have that label today from Ptolemy, a famous scientist, and we have other scientists following Ptolemy who spoke a lot about consciousness and particularly how reality existed. Because when we think of consciousness and we think of philosophy, we think of how do people come to determine what consciousness is? What is consciousness? And further on, we come to extrapolate, well, consciousness, right? The word consciousness literally has the word conscious in it. So it's someone who's aware, a state of awareness, the state of being, the state of I am. And we have other philosophers who cover this notion of consciousness in different ways. Some of them believe that consciousness comes from the state of the universe, right? The state of our Milky Way galaxy, for example, what I have behind me, and the state of how that correlates to our reality. Some philosophers believe that everything we had was just materials, and everything we are, and everything we'll ever be, consists of materials. Other philosophers believe that everything we have comes from our mind. And there's a famous drawing by Rene Descartes that actually shows this. That shows this man, and shows him pointing up to the pineal gland. And it talks about the relationship between the pineal gland and individuals' lives. And the pineal gland, which is the back portion of your brain, is supposed to believed to be, the metaphysical reality of notion, the metaphysical or biological component that creates metaphysical beliefs. So when we look at and we see, right, the different realities that exist, or our own reality, when we look at other realities of other people, or we think about those realities, we see that there's this form of consciousness, right? And many philosophers believe, particularly philosophers of mind, that there is a biological, physical component relayed through perception that shows people, specifically you and I, how things are and how we relate in our day-to-day lives and how we think. So when we look at consciousness in this perspective, we see that there are various differing views. And this video could go on for hours talking about those differing views. But essentially, in a nutshell, it boils down to a very small number of beliefs. Number one being materialism. Materialism, as I mentioned already, is the belief that all things are made out of materials, including the universe and everything that we know to exist. The other idea, right, is that things come from creation. Some people believe this, right? Some things that we're not created from materials, things are created outside of materials. So what are those materials? They're metaphysical beings or objects that establish that, such as God, right? Such as some people say that our mind, our consciousness existed from energy and it was created through, right, in and of itself through evolution. And then there's mixed beliefs that come and associate with that. The establishment of biology, the establishment particularly of our biochemistry and our human nature, the evolution of human beings. And then there's other beliefs that everything we have were created by a monotheistic Judeo-Christian God. There is that idea in philosophy. It exists. I have to bring it up. Many people don't like to hear this, but it is a theological belief, and a lot of philosophy that we have today was influenced by religious philosophy. It is important that we cover that notion. So we have the idea of materialism, I said before. We have the idea of, right, evolutionary thought, that our brain developed over time through lineage that came, if we study anthropology, it came from, right, chimpanzees. And then there's a branch of lineage that I can cover in another episode if you guys want to, about the anthropological aspect of ideas associated with consciousness in the mind, which comes from that. And then we also have, like I said, the theological notion that in our minds we're established, right, a God which created all wisdom, created all love, right? The definition of philosophy, so which we could understand as human beings so that we could love him. But what I really want to focus on is the idea of, right, consciousness, the state of being of the I, because many philosophers speak about this. What is this state of I, the state of understanding, right? How do we come to know this state? Well, for many people, it seems as if they have to question their own reality and their own decisions in life. They have to question the things they do, and they have to question the world they're in, and they have to expose themselves to their senses. Now, a lot of philosophy relates to a lot of science and describing a lot of the sensations and senses that we have. Many scientists who studied in the ancient times, and even some even now, use a lot of philosophy to describe their lives. They use a lot of these ideas to correspond with why they believe what they believe, such as why they believe why the stars, right, or the Milky Way galaxy, which is shown behind me with what I have, demonstrates that notion. When we see reality, when we see our lives, and when we see, right, physically with our own senses, feel things, right, when we use all our senses, we see, we physically touch, right, we smell, we taste, we use all of our five senses, we begin to realize that our conscious state is easily influenced. But philosophy objectively seeks many times, right, through the lens of logic and through other mechanisms to biological, etc., many people will argue, seeks to demonstrate consciousness. It seeks to find the answer to that question of what is consciousness, right? So there's systems that are put in place. There's logic, there's epistemology, right? There's metaphysics, and there's other branches of philosophy, particularly metaphysics, epistemology, right? And then we also have other forms that constitute how people can go about determining what consciousness is. Now, I haven't received any comments so far related to my videos. So if you guys have any questions, please leave a comment below. I like to talk more on the history of consciousness and philosophy, but when it comes to understanding consciousness, there's so much information out there to discuss. There's so much information you could look at, so many books you can read, so many philosophers you can learn about historically as well as read their information online. And hopefully this gave you a little bit of an introduction into consciousness and the philosophy associated with consciousness, because this video would take hours to describe this information. So if you'd like more information on this topic, on consciousness, on philosophy, or any of the 5 subject matters that I'll be covering in this series, please let me know below. My name is Anthony Pensa. This is the Love of Wisdom podcast. You can follow me on Instagram. You can follow me on YouTube here at the Love of Wisdom. If you haven't already, please subscribe. And if you have any questions, you could always leave a comment. You could always message me here on YouTube. And you could always talk to me, right? I can private message you as well, even on YouTube or Facebook. It's up to you guys. But just in that sense, right? The reality which we exist in and the reality which we know, it exists in a conscious state of mind, right? YouTubers and I, the people that are watching my videos, people that are looking at my face, that are looking at my background, that are looking at all the things that are here on the screen here that I'm showing you. This reality exists between us because you are seeing it. And I want to establish that connection. I want to establish that reality. Same as the philosopher's establishing his viewpoints and his questions in his life. Now, I want to leave you with one final thought before I close this video. And it's just an example here. Rene Descartes, he had sat down in the 16th century. And he had sat down on a chair, right? On a couch. And on that couch, there's a fireplace. And he was contemplating and writing about a piece of wax and how that wax was. And he was writing down and he was taking notes down about, what is this? What am I seeing? What is my senses and perception? Am I just a piece of wax? Right? What am I looking at? Now we take that analogy further, and Daniel Dennett talks about the idea of a brain in a vat. Are we solely just a brain in a vat that a scientist can manipulate and control? Or are we really in control of our reality? So I want to leave you with that. Are we really in control of our reality? Are we really in control of who we are as individuals, of our conscious states? Or are we merely just living and walking on this earth? Who are we and what is our purpose on this planet? Why are we here? What are we meant to do in this world? Right? People seem to talk about and say this on a daily basis, but I think it's self-evident that our reality and our conscious state is what we make of it, but it is influenced and it is adjusted within this massive grand scope of universe, the Milky Way galaxy behind me, the Milky Way galaxy in which we exist in, the planet Earth, amongst all the objects that we are associated with, including our minds. But particularly, we have this ability in our conscious state in our minds to write down these questions, these philosophical ideas, to think these thoughts in our mind and to portray them. And the great, beautiful thing about philosophy is that we have this ability to question everything, to question reality and our states, to question the affairs of our lives, and to make our lives better. So please, 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 if you haven't already, please contact me at the Love of Wisdom below here on YouTube. Thank you very much, and have a great day, guys.